I'm Scott Loughlin. This is the Data Chronicles, and here are your data points. What is artificial intelligence? In all of the laws that target AI, one question is consistent and universal. To what technology does this new law apply? It's important because, as we all know, AI is not particularly new. It's all around us, and it has been for some time. So if we're going to legislate AI with new laws, that doesn't mean that we are just legislating or applying new rules to products and services that are newly labeled with AI. In fact, these laws would apply much more broadly. And so if the laws are defining AI broadly enough, AI law could cover everything with a computer and a sensor, from the GPS in your car to the timer in your coffee pot to the phone in your pocket. And so it's really a critical definition and also, frankly, very difficult to nail down with precision. It's also not a theoretical debate because we have AI laws today and we have laws on the immediate horizon. For example, the EU AI Act is here, and it applies to AI and AI systems. So what does that mean for deployers and users of AI? What does it mean for developers and manufacturers of AI? What does it mean to become an AI system? The European Commission has now set out an answer, which is the discussion of today's episode. To discuss this, I've invited two of my colleagues, Etienne Drouard and Olga Kurochkina. Etienne and Olga are both data protection lawyers and AI lawyers in our Paris office who work with AI developers and deployers, manage compliance with the EU AI Act. Etienne, Olga, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Scott. Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Scott.
So, Etienne, maybe we start with you. So the European Commission has released these guidelines around trying to define specifically what is an AI system. Why is the European Commission looking to create this definition at this moment in time?
First, the European Commission is instrumental in general purpose AI models regulation, which means the core of any system that may be then used, transformed, evolved by some users of artificial intelligence. Therefore, the definition coming from the European Commission and from the EU AI Act is absolutely important to distinguish what is AI and what is not, for example, and then after provide some precisions on specific liability regimes, obligations to some service providers. So the definition of AI system for sure results from the Act plus the European Commission guidelines and orientations.
So they have a key role then, it sounds like, to be able to help scope what the EU AI Act is going to apply to. And as a result, I know one of the key questions that was coming up when the EU AI Act was first being debated is, well, what is AI? Which in some ways is the key question that I think we all struggle with. Olga, I'm interested maybe from your perspective, how did they seek to create this definition? And, what types of inputs, what types of perspectives do you think they were considering in laying out what they think that definition should include?
Right. So I think there has for a long time been a trend among different software players to just call their software AI because it was selling so well to other clients. And so a lot of things that we would not expect to be called AI kind of went to the same basket. And it's difficult now with the real rise of the technologies that we do consider legally to be AI to distinguish them from other basic output software. And the definition in the EU AI Act doesn't necessarily help because it is quite large. So the EU Commission tried to help to interpret it. It has provided some helpful feedback on some of the points and key points of that definitions. Some others remain quite large. For example, one of the conditions of the system to be considered an AI system is autonomy, but the EU Commission does consider that a simple input-output system could still be an AI system if human doesn't have any control over the outputs or any specific instructions. So I think a lot of programs could potentially be put under that notion.
So if I'm thinking about that, right? So if I'm understanding the way that the AI system was defined, or at least proposed to be defined, is it emphasized a couple of different factors. One is that it is machine-based, right? So it's non-human, and it has a level of autonomy that may be adaptive to different types of inputs that ultimately affect human behavior. Like those are the kind of things I would imagine this is. So like, what does that mean then in practice? So let's just take my example of a coffee pot. Coffee pot has been set to make sure that the temperature of it has been appropriately warmed by the time that I wake up. Is that AI? Or is that not AI in the context of the EU AI Act right now?
So if the instructions you're giving to your service are only executed by a product or a service, there is no artificial intelligence. The adaptiveness criterion is key there. The level of autonomy and the adaptiveness may happen after deployment. It means that it's not autonomous in the way it learns, but it's autonomous in the way it keeps learning even after you programmed your service. So the learning curve doesn't stop at the development level. It goes on more and more, learning after learning, when the software, the algorithms, the agent is used. So the question of evolution and adaptiveness and in the question of autonomy is part of what happens after the programming of an algorithm. And this is where you make a huge difference between software development and AI adaptiveness. Software development obeys to instructions. AI adaptiveness as a self-monitoring way to evolve after deployment.
So let's just, make sure I have this right, at least in my own mind. So suppose, for example, we have a coffee pot, as we just described. If I'm hearing you say that if I set the coffee pot to turn on at 6 a.m., because that's what time I aspire to wake up, that will not be AI, even though when I wake up and walk over to the coffee pot, it's already warm. However, let's then take it a step forward, because as you know, coffee pots with a timer, that technology has been around for some time. But now let's say we have one that's linked to my alarm clock, and we'd say that I am going to hit an alarm if I set my alarm on my bed for 6 a.m., that then tells the coffee pot that it should also be warm at 6 a.m., essentially the Internet of Things. Do we think that that would be sufficiently adaptive, or is that just effectively one machine speaking to another without that level of adaptiveness?
I would say in your example, this is Steve machine-to-machine instructions. So the day your coffee pot becomes being an AI system is when your coffee starts because you are snoring, because the sun is getting up in your room, because your alarm clock is ringing, and these factors trigger a decision which would have learned that you're about to be up and need a coffee.
So if the machine to machine communication, not adaptive, because it's just basically one speaking to another. Now, however, as you said, like, let's say that it knows that the machine starts to realize that there is a 20-minute gap between the time that my alarm goes off to the time that I, on average, pull the coffee out of the machine and drink my first cup of coffee, because presumably I've taken a shower and gotten dressed in that 20 minutes. And then it starts to learn about my behavior, which then adjusts how it performs. That sounds like that would be a trigger where I move from effectively Internet of Things machine kind of behavior to where it's now learned something to be adaptive to my experience and inputs.
Exactly. Learning from different criteria that you can identify a pattern in your morning habits. And this pattern is interpreted to create and trigger some actions, would be the result of an artificial intelligence, instead of just following a series of instructions. So the identification of a pattern, a look-like way of behaving, and then after a decision to adapt to this pattern and trigger a decision, which is I switch off this coffee pot and start making a coffee, is where you have AI.
If I could just add that unless this pattern is entirely dictated, in that it seems like a pattern, but it really isn't, because you actually said to the machine, look at the time when my alarm clock rings, then look at the time I switch the water on and switch the water off, and at that time, prepare the coffee. So it's ready when you go out from your shower, but it hasn't actually learned anything. It just followed your precise instructions that were admittedly better than just the alarm clock instructions.
So let's use another common form, right, that we probably take for granted, and that is like spell check, right, which is a simple form of potential artificial intelligence. And so spell check, right, is seeing a misspelled word, and then you can have it on autocorrect, as we probably have all experienced, where we send a text and it means something totally different than what we intended, because the machine is taking an input, seeing that it was then programmed to create some specific output. That we would say is non-adaptive, because it's simple logic. If you see it spelled this way, then produce it out this way. Versus if it sees Scott Loughlin say, you consistently spell this word wrong, we see that over and over and over again. And thus we are then going to apply a specific set of logic for you, Scott Loughlin. Is that the right kind of model? It seems as though when we're trying to break this down, it's going to be a lot of facts and circumstances analysis to try to look at these principles and factors applying to what is really complicated technology.
Yeah. And this is where predetermined instructions or self-identified patterns that may lead to an autonomous level of decision from an automated system makes the huge difference between automation and artificial intelligence. And this is where the clarification is mainly, as Olga said before, is mainly triggered by the need to differentiate the fancy use of a word from the application of a regulation. Because artificial intelligence is not anymore a technology or a buzzword, it is a regulation too. So when you claim you are providing, deploying, or using artificial intelligence, it comes with obligations, and you now should think twice before claiming there is AI in your service, because you need to prove it. And if you just claim it, it means you have obligations coming with it. And this is where these clarifications from the European Commission are useful, not only to clarify what are the obligations, but also what is outside of the scope of artificial intelligence under the AI Act.
So that's a really good and important point at the end, because as you can have seen in the market, that everybody seems to be claiming that all of their products are AI enabled, right? It's become an area where there's a lot of popular demand and interest. There's claims about AI, whitewashing, all of that stuff. But what you're saying is, hey, careful what you wish for. You may go out to the market and say this is AI, And, that's going to trigger a number of legal implications for you. And by the way, even if you don't call it AI, we're still going to be subject to these types of rules. Do you have this type of machine technology that is adaptive, that is going to be reactive to effectively human conditions to result in a specific output customized to the individual?
Exactly. Even in complex situations where you have tons of calculation layers, such as in the insurance industry, for example, where you will try to predict and anticipate the level of risk resulting from weather forecasts, traffic jams, temperatures in any fields, agriculture, transportation, etc. These calculation models have been existing for years, but they were only a series of mathematical instructions, part of which you had some probabilities at stake. But the meaningful effect of a specific criterion was, at the end of the day, still a series of instructions decided by mathematicians, risk calculation, without any level of autonomy. And this was complex, this was full of criterion, but this was not artificial intelligence. It becomes being artificial intelligence when some of the criterions and the way you will define rules are led to an autonomous way to calculate and decide what is relevant and what is not, compared with a mere series of mathematical calculations. This makes the difference between brain and artificial intelligence.
I mean, that makes sense. And so I guess maybe my question, maybe Olga, for you is, what is now the next step here, right? So we have this working definition, as I understand it. This is not hard and fast, right? This is a guidelines. And so where do the countries, the member states inside of the EU take this definition forward?
Right. So I think in any case, fortunately or unfortunately, we would have to have a real case by case analysis of any use case, whether it falls under this definition or not. Local authorities that will be created in some countries will probably provide their interpretation, but I don't believe we would be able to draw a really clear line, like black on white. This is definitely all AI. This is definitely not all AI. So we'd probably have to just rely on those criteria, provide the interpretation, and provide the justification for us as lawyers, for our clients, to say we do believe this is AI because of those factors, or we do believe we can justify that this is not really an AI based on those factors.
But are all of the member states going to agree now to use these factors, or can they just say, those are nice, but I actually think that AI should be more narrowly defined or more broadly defined?
So if you find some discrepancies between local interpretations and the one from the EU Commission, there will be a huge need for um, convergence of these interpretations, resulting from litigation and leading to arbitration from the European Court of Justice. The ultimate arbitration will come from jurisdictions and not only from regulators to get a consistent framework. And this is why, since this will take time, the best way to address the definition of AI and the consequences of the application of the AI Act is to take your own position, an argument why you consider you have an AI system and how you would consider you are subject to this regulation as a service provider, as a deployer, or as a user of AI system, depending on the way you can tweak, customize an AI model to your own needs using your own training data. So the best way to approach these different levels of interpretation is not only to look at closely what are the interpretations from the EU Commission, but also to take this material to document your own analysis of your position regarding the existence of an AI system, and then after, your role and the categories of obligations you are subject to. Because nobody will know it better than you until these laws and set of laws are completely clarified, which will take time. So therefore, these definitions that are critical to clarify should be complemented with your own documentation work, saying, I consider I'm subject to this because this is AI, and why should I consider this is AI? And I have this role as a provider, deployer, or user because I'm doing this and not this. So the accountability principle resulting from the AI Act, by which you need to document and have a governance system of your AI systems, pushes any stakeholder to position itself regarding this regulation, using guidelines from the European Commission to better position your own role in under this regulation.
So if I'm understanding that, Etienne, this is a set of guidelines that reflects a lot of input from a lot of different stakeholders. This is not dispositive, meaning that it's not an area where this is the final word. DPAs or other enforcement or authorities within the EU are going to have their own views about what an AI system looks like, maybe bringing off or considering what the European Commission said. Maybe they have a different point of view. Over time, we may get more clarity as case law comes out, but not an area where we're going to have any definitive conclusions at this stage. So the key, in light of that uncertainty, is for us to make sure that developers and deployers of this technology are documenting their conclusions to show that they were reasonably thought through, even if in the end a regulator were to disagree with our classification.
Exactly. And since nobody has 20 years of experience of the AI Act, the regulators don't have this maturity of implementation or analysis, and the stakeholders don't have to. The only way to comply with the entry into force of these regulations and comply with the obligations is to assess your category and your activity by documenting your training data. Where does it come from? External sources, internal sources. What is the main purposes of your AI system? Is it a model that learns to learn, or is it a system that is used for a specific purpose in your own situation? And are you a service provider, a deployer, or a user? The way you will consider yourself will determine the level of obligation you are subject to, and it has to stick to the facts. But the first milestone is to establish the facts. Which data am I using to do which part of my activities on a chain of responsibilities? Where do I stand? And since you need to evidence your governance of AI questions and AI systems to regulators, they will ask you who you are and what you are doing in the ecosystem of artificial intelligence services and deployings. So these definitions help to categorize the activity of each stakeholder until a regulator asks for compliance evidence.
Got it. Okay, so maybe my last question, Olga, if you want to take this one, is this is just one of the developments in a huge body of expected developments surrounding the EU AI Act. We have had a portion of the EU AI Act go into effect. More of it will go effect into the future. And just give our audience a perspective about where we currently stand with implementation and what we would expect the next shoe to drop in the the EU AI Act story.
So, as you said, Scott, thank you. Those are not the first guidelines from the European Commissions, and definitely not the last ones. So the EU Commission issued those guidelines on the definition of what the AI system is. We also already have the guidelines on what the prohibited AI systems are, and we will probably develop this subject further together. And the EU Commission has just launched the public consultation on the guidelines for the high-risk AI systems. So the public consultation actually ends today, but we should expect the finalized guidelines following this consultation pretty soon. And just today, it has also issued the guidance on the general purpose AI systems. So they're definitely not at rest and not on holiday yet. They are working on a lot of interesting subjects. And regarding what's already in force, well, since February this year, obviously, all of the AI systems that have been prohibited are prohibited since February and cannot be used in the EU. And in August this year, so on the 2nd of August, some other obligations of the EU AI Act are going to enter into force as well, including the obligations relating to the general purpose AI system. And this is actually the reason why the guidelines just came out like 2 weeks before the implementation deadline.
So what you're telling me is there's a lot of developments in the space. We expect probably many more on the immediate horizon, and for all organizations who are either subject to the EU AI Act or believe that they may be subject to the EU AI Act, a lot to do to be able to track and then adhere to all of these developments. Etienne, I'm interested. Maybe I'll give you the final word here. As you're working with organizations who are trying to track these many developments, any strategies from your perspective about how to keep all of these things straight? Because it seems as though trying to understand where we stand with the implementation and the guidance surrounding the EU AI Act could be almost a full-time job in and of itself.
Yes, and a part of this full-time job is to stick to product teams, strategic choices that are made within the organization in order to inventory the categories of projects, which service providers, which locations where services will be deployed are on the table within the company, so that the analysis and the compliance assessment can be performed. Each time there is a new regulation, it will have to be checked and compared with what is the inventory of AI projects run within the company. How do I govern my deployment or development teams? And I would say that the internal work should be very intense, while this regulatory watch is still on progress. But I would I would have an eye on the internal inventory, another one in the regulatory evolution. But for sure, regardless of any evolution, the time it will take to be clarified, being close to your teams in order to be ready to describe a situation to regulator by doing these inventories is absolutely crucial.
Yeah, really key to essentially have that effective and ongoing AI governance process to be ingesting all of these new rules and then being able to nimbly react around it. I think really good insights. So, really, thank you both for joining this podcast and for sharing your expertise with our audience. I'm sure there'll be a lot more to discuss in future episodes, but appreciate your perspective on this new one on that key question: what is AI? With that, I'm Scott Loughlin. This is the Data Chronicles, and those were your data points.